Let me start by saying it's my pleasure once again to introduce somebody to us as the speaker's host for today's meeting, and that is the presentation by Andrew Stock. You'll recall, you will have read, I'm sure, in the bulletin something about Andrew's outstanding... Have I got somebody else wanting to speak down there? Oh, thank you. I didn't think it was you, Tony. But you will have read, I think, in our bulletin something about Andrew's outstanding contribution to the Australian energy industry. And of course, he's practically, there's no subject that attracts more attention than energy these days in the media. Anyway, it's a pity that the myriad collection of, in my opinion, commentators don't actually know very much about this huge and complex industry. But Andrew does. Andrew knows all about it, and he knows all about it in detail. He was responsible during his 40-plus years in the industry for investigating options, planning their achievement, development, and their operation eventually, involving the investments, and I'm not joking when I say billions and billions of dollars. Energy production from fossil fuels through renewables, he's been there and he's done that, and he's played a major role in establishing the gas liquefaction facilities up in Gladstone as well. The subject of Andrew's talk today is the energy transition, global and local. I'm sure that grabs your attention. And I must add that Andrew is in inverted commas, in retirement, continues to add to the progress of the industry through his membership of numerous advisory boards and much more. So, retired perhaps, but right up to date, it's my pleasure to introduce Andrew Stock.
Thanks, Ollie, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to touch on a number of things in this talk this afternoon, and of necessity, because it is a complex field, focusing on a few, recognising the time and the nature of the industry. But firstly, where am I from today? One of the things I do in my so-called retirement is a councillor with the Climate Council. The Climate Council started the day after the previous Environment Minister, Greg Hunt, dismissed members of the Climate Commission, which was a federal agency, and that was the day that the Abbott LNP government was sworn in. The Commission members decided that this was important work and should continue, so they launched a successful crowdfunding campaign which saw the Climate Council established about 5 years ago now, and it's wholly funded by private donations from the public. Its aim is to provide authoritative information to the public on climate change, its impacts and solutions. And as I said, it's operated for nearly 5 years now and continues to go from strength to strength, and this slide just provides a few of the audience reach statistics. Why does energy matter? It drives the world economy and it sustains modern life. It powers food production, transport, heating and cooling, health, water, sanitation, all essentials of societies that are increasingly living in modern megalopolises, communication and entertainment, and the very industries that provide employment. What is the energy transition? This is my expression of it, but I believe it's a fundamental change that is occurring in the way that electricity, and more broadly energy, is produced and consumed. From dirty, dumb, centralised and analogue to clean, smart, decentralised and digital. Oh, that's not good. There we go. So, since the Industrial Revolution, the modern world has been powered by fossil fuels. Initially coal, then oil and later natural gas adding to the mix. And these provided tremendous advantages because the energy in those fuels was essentially sunlight that had been captured over millennia, transformed, and became highly concentrated, easily stored and transported. However, it had several drawbacks at mega scale, and one of those was the emissions that came with it, increasing air pollution, smog, particulates, in particular causing major health problems. And as the fossil fuel use ballooned, so did global emissions of greenhouse gases. And for most of us in this audience, it's interesting to reflect that that escalation has taken place largely in the last 70 years or so, mostly during our lifetimes, for those of you that are around my age or a bit more or less. And that's because populations increased dramatically, and so has industrialisation. And what that has done is it has increased the emissions in the atmosphere. So today we now have over 400 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere and increasing quantities of methane as well. It's causing the climate of the planet to change. There are a raft of supporting statistics, and among them are that 2016 and 17 are the warmest years since 1880, when general records, measured records began, and that reflects the inexorable increase in global temperatures. And we understand that in this country that temperature increases are intensifying weather, cyclones, hurricanes, tornadoes, drought and floods. And as ice caps melt and oceans warm, what we're seeing is sea levels rise and some dramatic impacts on some of the world's iconic ecosystems, including the Great Barrier Reef. So the imperative to address these and arrest these impacts has to start at its root cause. And the root cause is the emissions that come from burning fossil fuels to power our economy. So we have to turn our attention to how we stop that rise in emissions and then cut them dramatically. That's the transition that is now underway globally, and I'm going to talk more about, and how it translates locally. We know that internationally, governments have implemented and are implementing policies to deal with that. The Kyoto Agreement was about limiting developed country emissions. The Paris Agreement that followed included developing countries. And the aim is to reduce or keep world temperature rise below 2 degrees C from pre-industrial levels. And you could have seen from reflecting on that earlier chart that we're not that far away from 2 degrees C now. In fact, it's well over 1. The essence of the international agreements is to reduce emissions and to do that dramatically. Technology and government initiatives have key roles to play, both internationally and domestically. During the early years of the Kyoto period, countries like Germany, Denmark and Spain and Japan led with incentives to encourage the development and deployment of zero-emission energy technologies, including renewables, but particularly wind and solar. And what this chart shows is how the capacity of those two industries has grown quite significantly in the last decade or so. Through that time, the growth in the industry and the growth in the technologies was largely stimulated by government incentive programs. Initially with wind, and then increasingly we saw solar take off as well. As with all manufactured goods, and it doesn't matter whether it's a mobile phone, a car, or a television, increased scale of production and deployment delivers dramatic cost reductions. It's no surprise to anyone in manufacturing that this is the case, because it's a well-known feature. The cost reductions are reflected through experience curves. As global installed capacity for products increases, costs fall, and they fall exponentially. This is what the experience curves that I've shown here look like for onshore wind turbines and for solar PV panels. In the case of wind, for every doubling of global installed capacity, costs have come down 19%, and for solar PV panels, down 24%, which means when you translate it to years, that in the case of wind, costs have dropped 50% since 2009, and for solar PV, they've come down 80%. So with growth and scale and deployment, cost reductions and efficiency improvements mean that these technologies, wind and solar, are now the cheapest form of new power supply globally and in Australia. don't necessarily, as Ollie said, believe what you read in the press. Look at what's happening, and I'll talk about what's happening. Together, these technologies, zero-emission technologies, principally wind and solar, have dominated the capacity and the capital investment of new power generation every year globally since 2014. And in 2017, over 3/4 of this capacity added was zero emissions. In other words, it produces electricity with no emissions. So we hear a lot in Australia about heli plants for coal and other things. We don't see many of those being built now in the Western economies. At the same time as renewable businesses are booming globally, traditional fossil fuel industries are starting to feel that impact. We're now seeing virtually as many coal stations close as are being built globally. Well, who makes these new technologies that are the future today? From the mid-2000s, China's entered the field in manufacturing both wind and solar panels, and they've scaled up production dramatically and deployment dramatically. China, I have no doubt, sees renewables as a global growth market and is set on dominating that market globally. Companies headquartered in China have captured more market share in wind and solar than any other nation. About the same in wind as some of the large manufacturers in Europe, and clearly dominating the manufacture of solar PV panels. And deployment, you can see how China now leads the world in deploying wind and solar power. With the rapid rollout of renewables around the globe, technologists and engineers are thinking hard about the complementary systems that are needed to support a power supply system that is increasingly more digital than analogue, and clearly variable. Terms like digital inertia, fast frequency response and battery storage are entering popular language. And as renewable power penetration increases across our grids in the Western and developed economies, we are going to hear a lot more about these. Batteries are on the same cost-down curve that PV panels are. This is the line for batteries. Not my numbers, come from Bloomberg and other industry analysts. The power grids of the future are going to look increasingly different to those we have today. Power is going to flow in multiple directions from generation that sits both centrally and locally. We will see more microgrids. That's where regional towns and urban communities will be able to meet their own needs locally. In undeveloped countries or undeveloped regions of developing countries, we are likely to see centralised power systems ignored and leapfrogged to a phase of development that goes straight to microgrids and distributed generation and storage, just as happened in mobile telephones. If you go to places like Papua New Guinea, you do not see copper wire telephone systems. It's all mobile. And that, I believe, will start increasingly to happen with electricity as well in these economies. Well, what does all this mean for us, this global development mean for us locally? And as some have said to me, why should Australia take action to reduce our emissions? We are so small. Why do we matter? Well, we are small. This chart shows that Australia does produce less greenhouse gases than the top 5 global emitters here: China, India, US, Russia and Japan. But when you get below the top 5, which I've blown up in the bottom part of the chart, you can see Australia is in the top third of that. And collectively, those that aren't in the top 5 produce around half, just under half of global emissions. So if they all took this approach of saying, well, we're too small to matter, it becomes, it's not someone else's problem, it very rapidly becomes a global problem, because around half the globe's emissions would not be being dealt with. So if we look at other performance metrics on how Australia performs, we perform poorly. If you look at CO2 per capita on the left there, we are the second highest per capita emissions of CO2 globally, and we are in the top 5 or 6 on emissions per capita, emissions per unit of GDP. There aren't too many developed nations on the left of us. And when you come to measuring emissions per unit of power generated, megawatt hours, we have one of the dirtiest power systems in the world, bar none. Furthermore, unlike many countries, and a lot of these are European countries, but unlike many, including the United States, since 1990, our emissions have been going up, and they're up 25% on 1990 levels. So we've got a bigger challenge because a lot of these other countries also have seen their populations increase and their economies grow. Let's look at South Australia. South Australia, I believe, is a true global leader when it comes to the transition that's underway. It's been leading by doing, but let's look at the percentage of electricity we source from renewables. If South Australia here was a country, we would be second only to Denmark in the world in terms of the proportion of new renewables, that's wind and solar, that we use to generate electricity. And as in all technology transitions where the future is being created today, there are learnings to be had. There's no doubt about that, and we've seen some of those in this state. But if you reflect back on the speed of the transition that's been happening here, I believe that what we've seen in South Australia has been truly remarkable. Everyone talks about power prices, and I'm going to touch on that briefly. This chart shows South Australian power prices since around 2000 in the brown, and each other state on the national electricity market, together with what's happened to renewables in the state on the right-hand side, and some of the other events. But what you can see is that today, yes, we do have high power prices, but we had them back here when the renewables percentage was less than 10%. Oh, and by the way, in inflation-adjusted terms, they were higher at the start of the century when renewables in this state was zero. So my thesis is that, contrary to what we might read, high power prices have a lot more to do with other things, like the fact that gas prices have gone up 3 to 5 times, and gas prices frequently set the way that marginal electricity prices are set in the wholesale market. Or that, with about 6 months' notice, Alinta shut power stations, which meant that people couldn't pre-build capacity in advance of closure. Another thing we don't hear much about in South Australia is the fact that there's not a lot of competition in the electricity market. We get lots of offers, but when it comes down to it, who controls the market? And this chart shows that of the dispatchable generation in the state, that's currently the thermal plant, 98% of it's controlled by 4 companies. And 3 of those 4 companies control 3/4 of the mass market, that's you and me buying our electricity. What we saw was that that concentration, there are many ways of playing games in this complex industry, and that concentration allows these companies to play games which ultimately impact on our wallets. So South Australia's switch to renewables has delivered very positive results, billions of dollars invested, new jobs in the thousands, and dramatic reductions in greenhouse gases. And how's that gone? Well, this is how it's gone. The chart on the left, this is the top, shows the rest of the national electricity market, pretty much flat since 2007. This is South Australia's. We're down 40% on where we were a decade ago. And that's the sort of leadership that the rest of the nation needs to see from those that lead us in politics. What we see now is that this state frequently exports power to Victoria. We used to import it. On battery storage, we're a global leader too. The Tesla battery at Hornsdale is currently the world's largest. There are many bigger batteries now being built. It's had a dramatic impact on reducing the cost of power, far beyond its relative size in a complex area called frequency control ancillary services, where in the first 4 months of its operation, it cut the cost of that by 90%, delivering $35 million in savings. And before that, the cost of those services was being arguably priced quite ruthlessly by the gas generators and pushing up costs, which we were all seeing in our electricity prices. But this battery is doing more than that. It's incredibly indicative, I think, of the change that's going on in the technology. This is a report from a report that I emailed you back in March. It shows how, on the left, the jagged line and the red line's the control signals to the turbine generator in the power station down at Torrens Island, I think. The black line is how it responds. See how the difference is between the two lines? That's old analogue technology. This is digital technology. You can barely see the difference between the two lines, the way the battery is responding to the command signals from AEMO. That's the sort of world that we are heading into. I think over the next few years, we will see a lot more renewables built. It's in train already in this state. It will more than replace the capacity that was shut down when Northern was shut. We will see more grid strengthening with batteries, storage, and other forms of inertia to help provide that technical support. We live in South Australia. It's the driest state and the driest continent, and we need to be a leader when it comes to dealing with climate change, in my view. And South Australians overwhelmingly feel, as reflected by many market surveys, that this is the right thing to be doing. If we need as a nation, though, to deal with this issue, then we're going to have to deal with it nationally. Unfortunately, the National Energy Guarantee, which I won't talk about today much, doesn't deal with the issue, notwithstanding what you might read. The electricity sector will deal with a paltry amount, given it's being asked to deal with its pro rata share of that 26% reduction by 2030, but it's already well on the way due to the renewable energy target. Most of the emission reductions that need to be done by 2030 in electricity will be delivered by 2020 because of the renewable energy target and people around this room and others putting solar panels on their roofs. But what it does mean is that those other sectors of our economy that produce emissions, direct combustion, that's things like LNG plants, mines, transport, fugitives, that's the stuff that leaks out of the ground, industrials. Look at the percentage reductions they are going to have to achieve over the next decade and a bit, because electricity is being asked to do what we believe is a woefully inadequate challenge. So there's more that you can read about that on reports that are available from the Climate Council on their website. We try and write things that are intelligible to the average person. That's quite a challenge for me, and there's a lot of help I get in doing that. Hopefully today I have not skipped too quickly over things, but have given you some basis to go and maybe look and find out more. But it's a huge challenge we face. The good news really is that in this state we're in front of the pack. We need to stay there, and when you have the opportunity and you see people from interstate, tell them we're doing a good job, because often people believe what they read in the press, unfortunately. So thank you for the opportunity.
So we've got time for one or two questions. Rotations and guests, is there anybody who'd like to? We've got microphones out there. Yes, we've got one over there.
It's interesting, although not surprising, that South Australia's leading the pack, but it seems to me we are paying a price for it that's quite high in our power right now. And today, coal prices have been shooting up. And my reading of that is the world doesn't give a stuff. Nothing's changed in the world. Coal's getting dearer, and we're paying more for our electricity. Could you put some wisdom into that statement?
Do you want help from the press?
Like many markets, for commodities, prices go up and down, and they do in electricity as well. My view is that when that extra capacity that is now being built in South Australia comes online, I think we'll see our power prices come off a lot more than they have. We need in this state to deal with the competition issue as well, because one of the reasons we don't see that as consumers is because we don't have much competition in that wholesale market and, frankly, in the market for supplying us. And that's a continuing challenge. When it comes to coal, look, the world still burns a lot of coal. The problem is that if the world continues to burn that coal for the next 30 or 40 years, our children and grandchildren will be dealing with a world that isn't 2 degrees hotter but 4 degrees. And frankly, no one, I'm not a climate scientist, but no one knows what impact those temperatures will have on ecosystems. We've already seen what 1 degree or thereabouts does with the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef and reefs around the world, it's not just the Great Barrier Reef that have been affected, are the nurseries, as are mangroves, for fish. Fish feed a lot of the world's population. So I think what we don't know is where we're headed, but what we do know is if we keep putting fossil fuels in the air, then we're headed in one direction, and that's not a very positive one. So I guess, you know, without directly answering the question, the reality is that around the world globally, there are as many coal-fired plants now closing as there are opening. People are not investing overwhelmingly now in large new coal mines. They may continue to do that in this country for a bit with private capital. I suspect they won't do new coal mines very often with debt from Australian banks or international banks. And I think we'll increasingly see that transition happen. Ultimately, the thing that will be the death knot for coal, though, and it was reported, I think, just today in somewhere I read, that Bloomberg came out overnight with a report that said by, I think, the mid-2020s or early 2030s, the new build costs for renewables will be less than the ongoing operating costs of coal-fired power. So when you can build a new power station for less than it costs to continue to run the old one, there's a one-way trip for coal, and that's out of our electricity supply. It's going to take a fair while for it to happen, in some countries more than others, but I think it's inevitable. Sorry, Rob, I think.
Thank you. Very interesting. The lithium battery and the life expectancy of the Tesla battery. Question one. Question two is, what happens with those old batteries when you have to dispose of them? Question three is basically how much energy goes into producing these batteries, and how much carbon is generated in producing these batteries, digging up the lithium that are processing, etc.
Okay, so how long do they last? Well, the Hornsdale battery system is basically a set of modules, right? Just as solar panels are a set of modules. So if one gets performance drops off, and every one of these is clearly monitored real time every day, and every probably second of every day or millisecond, what you can do is just basically unplug one and put a new one in. So the thing will last forever in that sense, just by replacing the modules that may go off in performance. The product's warranted in a household for 10 years with a performance degradation curve, so that degradation does happen. So that's about the lifetime. Solar panels last for 25 years, but you know, they last a lot longer. What happens to the products once they're finished with? I think I read the other day that the intention is of battery manufacturers is to reclaim the products and recycle them. And that makes sense because they can contain things like cobalt and other rare elements that once you get to scale will be more valuable to recycle than to dump. And thirdly, how much energy does it take to make a battery? I don't know the answer to that. Batteries in themselves don't make energy. What they do is store it. And what's important is the round trip efficiency. From when you take a megawatt hour in, to putting it back out, how much of it do you lose? Well, with lithium ion, if my memory serves me correct, it's in the 90%, mid-90s. If you read the stuff that Snowy Hydro's put out on the Snowy 2.0, when that thing's running flat chat, its round trip efficiency when you take on transmission losses as well is about 60%. And if you run Snowy 2.0 on coal-fired power from the black coal stations in New South Wales, you will have a worse emissions signature for that electricity delivered out than you would by running Hazelwood in Victoria. So Snowy 2.0 is a very, very inefficient, it's very large in terms of capacity and energy, but it's very inefficient as a storage mechanism.
Time, we haven't really got time, but we'll ask that you've been asking for a while over here. Yeah.
Thank you. My question's about employment. So we talk about the new jobs that are being created by the renewable system. Is there anybody that's done any calculations on, like, if we've got rid of coal finally, how many mine workers are out of work, compared with those that are employed in, installing and maintaining and developing the new system?
Yeah. So the Climate Council did a report on that about 18 months ago with modelling by Ernst & Young. And that modelling showed that and that was looking at targeting, I think from memory, 50% renewables in across Australia by 2030, and what it showed, when you included the losses of jobs in the mining sector and the coal-fired power stations that would shut, there would be a net additional just under 30,000 jobs nationally. Some states are better off, but all states had net increases in employment as a result of that transition. But that report would be on that website, so if you want to get the detail, it's there.